In the summer of 1977, a woman named Ruth Schultz was given permission to leave Jonestown. Not to visit, not temporarily, to leave permanently. She had a sister in Ohio who had written 3 times requesting her return. She had a medical condition that the settlement's facilities could not adequately treat. She had been in People's Temple for 11 years, had followed Jones from Indiana to California to Guyana, had given everything she had given in the way that long-term members gave everything gradually, then completely, then in ways that made it difficult to remember what having anything had felt like. The permission was granted on a Tuesday. Jones himself told her. He told her in the intimate voice, the one that made you feel the conversation was only for you, that she had served faithfully, that her health required this, that the community would carry her in its heart. She had a week to prepare. Transportation was arranged. On the following Monday morning, Ruth Schultz was packed and ready, and the boat that would take her to Georgetown was waiting at the dock. And she did not get on it. She sent word that she had changed her mind. She stayed in Jonestown for the next 16 months. She was there on November 18, 1978. She did not survive. The question of why Ruth Schultz did not get on that boat is the question this video is about. Not because her story is unique, there were others who had opportunities to leave and did not take them, others whose accounts have been partially documented and partially lost to the silence that follows catastrophe. But because her story is the most completely documented, because the researcher who found it spent years trying to answer that question and arrived at an answer that is more uncomfortable than any of the explanations that are usually offered for why people stayed in Jonestown. And because the answer, once you hear it, does not stay in Jonestown, it follows you. If you have ever stayed somewhere you could have left, in a relationship, a job, a situation, a version of yourself, subscribe right now and hit the bell. Because what kept Ruth Schultz off that boat is not a story about manipulation or weakness or the particular conditions of a cult in a jungle. It is a story about something much closer to home. Go back to before Jonestown. Go back to Ruth Schultz in 1966. The year she joined People's Temple in Indianapolis. She was 23 years old. She had grown up in a family that was, by every account she later gave to researchers, not cruel but absent, parents who were present physically and unavailable emotionally, a childhood that was not traumatic in the ways that social workers document but that had produced, in the young woman who joined People's Temple at 23, a particular kind of hunger. The hunger of someone who had grown up in a house where nothing was named, where feelings were not discussed because there was no language for them, where the texture of daily life was functional and affectless and sufficient in every material way and insufficient in the way that is hardest to articulate because it has no name. She was not abused. She was not neglected. She was unseen. And when Jim Jones looked at her, in the second week of her attendance at a People's Temple service in Indianapolis, and said something, she would not tell researchers what he said, only that it was accurate, only that it named something she had never heard named. She felt something that she had no prior experience of feeling. She felt found. This is the foundation. Not the theology, not the politics, not the community programs, not any of the things that People's Temple offered that are usually cited as the reasons people joined. Those things were real and they mattered. But underneath them, in Ruth Schultz and in the hundreds of others whose entry into People's Temple followed a similar pattern, was this: the experience of being seen by someone who had the ability to find the specific thing a person was carrying and name it. And once you had been found, once the wound had been named, once the hunger had been acknowledged, once the thing you had spent your life not being able to say had been said for you by someone who seemed to have always known it, the question of leaving became a question about whether you were willing to go back to being unseen, whether you could put down the found feeling and return to the life you had been living before someone looked at you and knew you. Ruth Schultz could not put it down. 11 years of following Jones, from Indianapolis to California to a jungle in Guyana, is not the behavior of someone who was simply manipulated. Manipulation, sustained over 11 years across 3 different geographical and organizational contexts, requires the active participation of the person being manipulated in ways that the word manipulation does not capture. She was not passive. She was not deceived in the straightforward sense. She knew, by the time she had been in People's Temple for 3 or 4 years, that not everything Jones said was true. She knew there were performances. She knew the healings were staged. She knew that the threat he described was, at least partly, a management tool rather than a genuine assessment of danger. She knew these things and she stayed, because what she was staying for was not the theology or the truth claims or the political project. She was staying for the found feeling. She was staying because leaving meant returning to the life in which she had not been found. And that life, by 1977, was 11 years behind her and had no road back. The researcher who found Ruth Schultz's story was a sociologist named David Parrish, who spent 7 years in the 1980s and 90s interviewing People's Temple survivors and family members of those who had not survived. Parrish was looking specifically for cases of people who had had clear opportunities to leave, documented, verifiable opportunities, not just the theoretical possibility of leaving that always existed, and who had not taken them. He found 9 such cases. Ruth Ann Schultz was the most thoroughly documented because her sister in Ohio had kept every letter, had documented the process of requesting Ruth Ann's return, and had spoken extensively to Parrish about the months preceding the boat that Ruth Ann did not board. But the other 8 cases followed a pattern that Parrish found consistent enough to constitute a finding. In every case, the person who had the opportunity to leave and did not take it described, in one form or another, a version of the same thing. Not fear of Jones's retaliation, though that fear was present in some cases. Not confusion about what was real, though that confusion was present in most. Something else, something that Parrish spent 3 years trying to name accurately and that he finally described, in the paper he published in 1993, as the problem of the found life. The found life, as Parrish describes it, is the life that becomes possible when you have been seen. When someone has found the wound and named it and given you, for the first time, the experience of being known. That experience does not simply feel good. It reorganizes. It becomes the reference point against which everything else is measured. The life before being found, the years of invisibility, the functional sufficiency and emotional absence, the hunger that had no name, becomes not just a memory but a threat. The threat of return, the threat of going back. And when leaving the found life means going back to the unfound life, the calculation is not the one that outsiders assume. The outsider assumes that the person is choosing between captivity and freedom. The person inside is choosing between the found life and the unfound life, between being known and being invisible, between the wound being named and the wound being carried alone again. And that calculation, made by someone who has been inside the found life for 11 years, who has no memory of feeling found anywhere else, who has no reason to believe that the world outside will find them the way Jones found them, does not produce the choice that the outsider expects. Ruth Ann Schultz stood at the dock on that Monday morning in 1977 with her bags packed and the boat waiting and 16 months of life still ahead of her, and made a calculation that Parrish spent years trying to reconstruct. He could not reconstruct it fully because she did not survive to tell him. What he had was her sister's account of the letters, the voice on the telephone in the days before the boat, and a single sentence that Ruth Ann apparently said to a fellow member. A woman named Carol Webb who did survive and who told Parrish about the conversation years later. Ruth Ann, according to Carol Webb, said this: "I know what is out there. I lived there for 23 years, and no one ever looked at me the way they look at me here. I cannot go back to being no one." Carol Webb said she did not fully understand the sentence at the time. She said she understood it completely afterward. She said, Ruth Ann was not confused. She was not brainwashed in the way people mean when they say that word. She knew exactly what she was choosing and exactly what she was giving up. She just could not make herself give it up, because what she was giving up was the only time in her life she had ever felt real. And you do not give that up for a boat to Ohio. You do not give that up for anything, unless you can find it somewhere else first. And she could not find it anywhere else. None of us could. That was the whole thing. That was always the whole thing. Parrish published his paper in 1993. It was reviewed carefully and cited occasionally and read by the specialist community that studies coercive organizations, and then, like most academic work on Jonestown, it settled into the archive where the specialist community keeps the things it has found but that the broader culture is not ready to engage with. Because what Parrish found, the thing the paper names and documents and traces through 9 individual cases, is not comfortable. It does not produce the clean narrative that most accounts of Jonestown produce: the manipulator and the manipulated, the predator and the vulnerable, the monster and the victims. It produces something more difficult. It produces the portrait of people who were not stupid or weak or uniquely damaged but who were hungry in a way that most people are hungry, and who found, in people's temple, something that fed that hunger, and who could not walk away from the feeding even when they knew the feeder was dangerous, even when they could see what was coming, even when the boat was waiting. The 9 cases in Parrish's study are all dead. None of them got on their boats. None of them made it out before November 18, 1978. They stayed for different reasons, and they stayed for the same reason, and the same reason is the one that Ruth Ann Schultz gave to Carol Webb on the dock in the summer of 1977. I cannot go back to being no one. It is the most human sentence in the entire Jonestown archive. It is more human than the theology and more human than the politics and more human than any of the explanations that have been offered for how 900 people ended up in a jungle in Guyana following a man who was, by the end, genuinely dangerous and genuinely ill and genuinely beyond the reach of the community he had built. It is more human because it is recognizable. Because the hunger it describes is not the hunger of the manipulated or the vulnerable or the uniquely broken. It is the hunger of anyone who has ever felt invisible, of anyone who has ever wanted, more than they wanted, safety or rationality or the boat back to Ohio, to be seen by someone who could find the wound and name it. That hunger is everywhere. It is in every room. It is in every person who has ever stayed somewhere they could have left because leaving meant returning to a version of themselves they could not bear to be again. Jones found that hunger and used it. He was not the first and he was not the last. He was the most catastrophic, in this case, because the hunger he fed was in 900 people at once and the feeding was in a jungle with no way out. But the hunger itself, the found life, the wound named, the invisibility ended, that is not a pathology. That is a human need so fundamental that 900 people stayed in a jungle rather than go back to living without it. Ruth and Schultz did not get on the boat. She could not go back to being no one. That is the whole story. And it does not end in Jonestown. There is a detail in the sister's account, the sister in Ohio who wrote 3 letters and waited for Ruth and to come home, that Parrish includes at the end of his paper almost as a footnote, and that is, in many ways, the most important detail in the entire account. The sister's name was Margaret. She had not seen Ruth in 4 years when she wrote the first letter requesting her return. She had not been close to Ruth and growing up, they had been raised in the same functional, affectless house, had shared the same hunger without knowing the other had it, had gone their separate ways in early adulthood without the kind of bond that either of them had known how to build. Margaret wrote the letters because Ruth was the only family she had left, not because they had been close, because there was no one else. When Parrish interviewed Margaret in 1988, 10 years after Jonestown, in the house in Ohio where she had waited for a sister who never came, he asked her whether she understood why Ruth had not gotten on the boat. Margaret thought for a long time before answering. Then she said something that Parrish quotes at the end of the paper and that has stayed with every researcher who has read it since. She said, "I think Ruth and I had the same problem. We grew up in the same house with the same problem. Neither of us knew how to let someone find us. Ruth found someone who could do it. I never did. I used to think she was the one who made the wrong choice. I spent 10 years thinking that, but I am not sure anymore. I think she found something real, in a terrible place, at a terrible cost, and I never found it anywhere. I am not sure which of us had the harder life. I have thought about it for 10 years and I am not sure." Parrish does not comment on this statement in the paper. He does not analyze it or contextualize it or place it in the framework he has built. He quotes it and stops. The paper ends with Margaret's words, which is the right decision and also the most uncomfortable one, because Margaret's words do what the best survivor testimony always does: they refuse to let the story be about the people who died. They insist that the story is also about the people who lived, about what it cost to live outside the found life, about what it means to never be found at all, about the hunger that does not require a Jim Jones to be present and does not require a Jonestown to make itself felt, the hunger that is there in the functional, affectless house, in the relationship that is sufficient and insufficient, in the version of yourself that is visible to everyone and known by no one, the hunger that Ruth and Schultz tried to satisfy in a jungle in Guyana and that Margaret Schultz tried to satisfy in a house in Ohio, and that both of them carried for their entire lives without either of them ever having the language to name it to the other. Until Parrish came and asked the right question and Margaret, 10 years after Jonestown, finally named it, to a stranger, in a house where she had waited for her sister, the only family she had left, who never came home. David Parrish died in 2006. He had spent 20 years on Jonestown material and had published a handful of papers that the specialist community valued and that the broader culture never found. His daughter, in the obituary she wrote for a small academic newsletter, said that her father had told her, near the end of his life, that the paper on the found life was the most important thing he had written. Not the most cited, not the most technically rigorous, the most important. She asked him why. He said, "Because it is the only thing I wrote that is about everyone. Everything else I wrote was about Jonestown, specifically about that place, those people, those circumstances. But the found life paper is not about Jonestown. It is about the hunger. The hunger is everywhere. Jones found it and used it and 900 people died because of what he did with it. But the hunger was there before him and it is still there now and it will be there when the last person who remembers Jonestown is gone. The hunger to be found. The terror of going back to being no one. Everyone has it. Most people never find anyone who can see it. Ruth and Schultz found someone. It cost her everything. And I have spent 20 years trying to figure out whether that makes her story a tragedy or something else entirely. I have not figured it out. I do not think I am going to." His daughter said he was quiet for a moment after saying this. Then he said, "Margaret was right. I do not know which of them had the harder life. I have thought about it for 20 years and I do not know. The paper is in the archive. The letters Margaret wrote to Ruth are in the archive. The boat that waited at the dock on a Monday morning in 1977 is long gone, dissolved into the history of a settlement that the jungle reclaimed years ago. Ruth and Schultz is in the archive too, in the list of 918 names that is the most complete document Jonestown left behind. Her name is there, between the name before it and the name after it, one of 918. Found, for 11 years, in a terrible place at a terrible cost, and then not found anywhere. The way most people are not found anywhere. The way the hunger, most of the time, goes unanswered. The way the boat waits and we do not get on it, not because we are manipulated or confused or broken, but because we cannot go back to being no one. Because no one can. Because that is the whole story, and it does not end in Jonestown, and it did not start there either. It started in every house where the hunger grew in silence and was never named. It started there. It is still there. In every house where the hunger was never named. In every life where the boat waited and no one got on it.